Robert Whitney had always been a dreamer, the kind of person who saw stories in the most ordinary details of life. A cracked sidewalk became a battle-scarred road, an empty coffee shop, the backdrop for unspoken heartbreak. But lately, his imagination had failed him. The words that once poured from his fingertips onto his laptop screen now refused to come. Deadlines loomed like storm clouds, and the bright future he had envisioned for himself as a screenwriter seemed to be slipping away. When the letter arrived informing him that his late grandfather, Howard Whitney, had left him an island, Robert didn't know what to think. He hadn't been close to the old man. Howard had always been something of a recluse, more at home in his solitude than in the company of his family. Robert's parents had spoken of him with a mix of respect and frustration, a man with little patience for the mundane but endless curiosity for the unexplored. The island, as it was called, was a place whispered about in family lore but seldom visited. Supposedly, it was where Howard had spent his last decades, collecting artifacts, writing in journals, and generally keeping to himself. The timing, Robert thought, was either serendipitous or cruel. With his career stalled and his creativity at an all-time low, the idea of retreating to an isolated island was both daunting and strangely appealing. What better place to reconnect with himself and rediscover his voice? It didn't take long for him to decide. Within a week of receiving the letter, he packed his things, left the bustle of Los Angeles behind, and set off for the small, unnamed island nestled in a quiet lake somewhere in Maine. The journey there was as peaceful as it was surreal. A small boat ferried him across the still waters, the ripples from the motor spreading in concentric circles until they faded into the glassy surface. The island itself was modest in size, no more than a mile across, with dense trees that formed a natural barrier around a small clearing where the house stood. The building was weathered but sturdy, a rustic wooden cabin with a stone chimney and a porch that overlooked the lake. It wasn't luxurious, but it had character, the kind that whispered stories of a life lived in quiet contemplation. Stepping onto the dock, Robert felt an unexpected sense of connection to the place. It was as if the island had been waiting for him, holding its breath through years of silence, ready to exhale and share its secrets. He spent his first days exploring, familiarizing himself with the surroundings. There was a small garden overgrown with weeds, a shed filled with dusty tools, and a path that wound through the woods to a rocky outcrop on the northern edge of the island. From there he could see the mainland, a strip of distant shoreline dotted with a few houses. It was on his third day that he noticed something odd. While walking along the southern shore, he spotted what appeared to be a wooden bridge, extending from the mainland to his island. The structure was crude but sturdy, with fresh planks that suggested it had been built recently. Robert frowned. The property was supposed to be private. He'd checked the deed himself before coming. So why was there a bridge? And who had built it? Curiosity turned to unease as he approached the bridge and saw a small sign hammered into the ground at its base. Courtesy of Karen Grayson, it read in neat, printed letters. Robert vaguely remembered the name from one of the documents his lawyer had sent over a neighbor who owned a property on the mainland. He hadn't given her much thought at the time, assuming she was just another local who lived quietly and minded her own business. Clearly, he'd been mistaken. That evening, as he sat on the porch, the sight of the bridge lingered in his mind. It wasn't just the audacity of someone building on his land without permission, it was the implications. A bridge wasn't something you built on a whim. It was deliberate, permanent. It signaled ownership, control. Robert had come here to escape complications, not to find himself embroiled in territorial disputes. The next morning he decided to confront the issue head-on. He walked down to the bridge, tools in hand, and began dismantling it. The wood was fresh, the nails driven deep, but Robert worked methodically, pulling each plank free and stacking them neatly on the shore. He wasn't reckless about it. If Karen wanted her bridge back, she could come and retrieve the materials herself. By mid-afternoon, the structure was gone, and Robert felt a small sense of satisfaction. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to disrupt his peace. But his sense of control was short-lived. That evening, as he was unpacking boxes in the cabin, he heard the distant hum of a boat engine. Stepping out onto the porch, he saw a small motorboat approach. Karen wasted no time making her presence known. "You've made quite the mess," she called out as the boat pulled up to the dock. Her voice was sharp, with the kind of tone that suggested she was used to getting her way. "I could say the same," Robert replied, crossing his arms as he waited for her to disembark. Karen stepped onto the dock with an air of authority, as if the island belonged to her. "I built that bridge for the community," she said. "It's meant to provide access for educational purposes, historical tours, environmental studies. Your grandfather wouldn't have minded." "My grandfather didn't build a bridge," Robert countered. "And this isn't a community property. It's private. You're trespassing." Karen's eyes narrowed, her smile turning icy. "I see you're going to be difficult about this," she said. "I'll have you know I've already spoken to the town council, and they support my project. If you want to cause problems, that's your choice, but I wouldn't recommend it." With that, she turned and walked back to her boat, leaving Robert with a sinking feeling in his gut. He had come here for solitude, for inspiration. The morning after Karen's visit, Robert woke up feeling a mixture of anger and unease. The confrontation with her had left him restless, replaying her words in his mind like a broken record. Robert made himself coffee and stood on the porch, staring out at the spot where the bridge had been. The pile of disassembled wood lay untouched on the shore, but the sight of it did little to ease his frustration. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had come to the island for peace, to escape the noise and chaos of his life in Los Angeles, not to be dragged into a territorial battle. Determined to get to the bottom of the situation, Robert decided to take the fight to Karen's turf. He rowed across the lake to the mainland and made his way to her property, which, as it turned out, was far grander than he had expected. Her house was a sprawling colonial-style building with perfectly manicured lawns and a long driveway lined with flowering shrubs. It stood in stark contrast to Robert's rustic cabin, and he couldn't help but feel a pang of resentment as he approached. Karen was outside, supervising a group of workers who were unloading crates from the back of a truck. She spotted him before he could announce himself and greeted him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Robert," she said, her tone saccharine. "What a pleasant surprise. To what do I owe the honor?" "I want to know what you're really doing," he said, skipping the pleasantries. "That bridge wasn't for community access. You're trying to take control of the island, aren't you?" Karen's smile faltered, but only for a moment. She waved a hand dismissively, as if his accusations were too absurd to warrant a serious response. "Robert, you're being dramatic. The bridge was a practical solution, nothing more. Do you have any idea how many people have expressed interest in the island? Educators, environmentalists, even local historians. It's a treasure trove of untapped potential. It's not theirs to tap into," Robert shot back. "The island is private property, my property, and I'm not interested in sharing it with anyone." Karen's expression hardened, and for the first time, Robert saw a glimpse of the steel behind her polished exterior. "Your grandfather would be ashamed of you," she said coldly. "Howard understood the value of community. He welcomed people to the island. He didn't hoard it like some selfish recluse." "That's not how I remember him," Robert said. "And even if it were true, it doesn't give you the right to build on my land without permission." Karen let out a theatrical sigh, as if she were dealing with an unreasonable child. "I've tried to be patient with you," she said. "But if you're going to insist on being difficult, then I'll have to pursue other avenues. Legal ones." Robert felt his stomach tighten. "You're threatening to sue me?" "Not a threat," Karen said, her voice as smooth as glass. "A promise. And you might want to think carefully before you escalate things. The town council is already on my side. Do you really want to go up against the entire community?" Robert didn't bother responding. He turned and walked back to his boat, Karen's words echoing in his ears. The town council. What did they have to do with any of this? And why would they support her? Back at the cabin, Robert spent the rest of the day poring over the documents his lawyer had sent him when the property was transferred. The deed was clear. The island was private property, with no easements or shared rights. But Karen's confidence had rattled him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she might have found a loophole. The next day, he drove to the municipal office to check the records for himself. The clerk at the front desk was polite but unhelpful, insisting that all inquiries about property disputes needed to be handled through official channels. Frustrated, Robert demanded to see the permits for the bridge. After some back and forth, The clerk relented and handed him a folder with a single sheet of paper, a building permit issued 6 months ago. Robert's eyes scanned the document, his pulse quickening as he read the details. The permit listed Karen Grayson as the applicant and cited community infrastructure improvements as the purpose of the construction. Beneath her name was a signature that made his blood run cold, Howard Whitney. It couldn't be real. His grandfather had been dead for over a year. There was no way he could have signed off on this permit. And yet there it was, clear as day, his name scrawled in ink at the bottom of the page. Robert's mind raced as he left the municipal office. Was it a forgery? If so, how had Karen pulled it off? And why hadn't anyone questioned it? The implications were dizzying. If Karen was willing to falsify documents, then what else was she capable of? That evening, as he sat on the porch, Robert's unease turned to anger. He wasn't just dealing with an overzealous neighbor. Karen was playing dirty, and she wasn't going to stop until she got what she could. He needed to fight back, but he also needed to be smart about it. The first step was gathering evidence. He retrieved his phone and began taking photos of everything: the pile of wood from the dismantled bridge, the signs Karen had left on the shore, even the permit he had copied at the municipal office. If this went to court, he needed to be prepared. But evidence alone wouldn't be enough. Karen had already shown that she wasn't afraid to manipulate people to get her way. If the town council was really on her side, then Robert was at a disadvantage. He needed allies, someone who could help him counter her influence. The next morning he drove into town and began asking questions. Most people were tight-lipped, but a few were willing to talk, albeit cautiously. One elderly man at the general store mentioned that Karen had been another resident, a woman in her 30s, hinted that Karen's projects weren't always as altruistic as they seemed. She makes it sound like she's doing things for the community, she said, but really, it's all about her. You should look. Robert's suspicions deepened as he drove back to the cabin. Karen's web of influence was larger than he had imagined, and untangling it was going to take. That night, as he reviewed his notes and planned his next move, he heard the unmistakable sound of an. Karen stepped onto the dock with the same air of confidence she had displayed before, but this time there was a smugness to her demeanor that set Robert on edge. "I thought I'd give you one last chance," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "If you agree to my terms, we can avoid all this unpleasantness." Robert crossed his arms, his expression hard. "What terms?" Karen smiled. "Simple. You allow me to maintain the bridge, and in exchange, I'll give you a share of the revenue from the tours. It's a win-win. And if I say no?" Karen's smile widened. "Then I'll see you in court." Robert didn't flinch. "You'd better bring more than a fake signature," he said. Karen's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the mask slipped. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice low and venomous. "This island isn't just yours, Robert. It never was." With that, she turned and walked back to her boat, leaving Robert standing on the dock, his fists clenched. She had declared war, and Robert knew he had no choice but to fight. The lawsuit arrived less than a week later. Furious but determined, Robert reached out to a lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Emily Hayes who specialized in property disputes. She met him at her office in town, her desk cluttered with files and a half-empty cup of coffee. As Robert explained the situation, showing her the documents and detailing Karen's actions, Emily's expression darkened. "This isn't a property dispute," she said finally, tapping the lawsuit with her pen. "It's a land grab. She's hoping you'll either give up or run out of money before you can fight back." "She's claiming part of the island belongs to her," Robert said. "Is that even possible?" Emily leaned back in her chair, considering. "Anything's possible if she can make the case stick. That map she's using, if it predates your grandfather's deed and shows her property overlapping with yours, it could complicate things. We'll need to prove it's invalid or irrelevant. But more importantly, we need to figure out why she's doing this. What's so important about your island that she's willing to go this far?" Robert hesitated, then told her about the strange signature on the bridge permit, the rumors he'd heard about Karen's fundraisers, and the feeling that she was after something more than just public access. Emily's eyebrows rose as he spoke. "She's not just pushing boundaries," Emily said. "She's fabricating them. This could work in your favor." If we can prove she falsified that signature or misrepresented her intentions to the town council, it'll undermine her entire case. But that's going to take time and money. I'll do whatever it takes, Robert said, though the thought of draining his savings made his stomach churn. Emily gave him a sharp nod. Good. Then let's start with the basics. I'll file a response to the lawsuit and request a temporary injunction to prevent her from building or accessing the island until this is resolved. In the meantime, you need to keep a low profile. Don't engage with her directly. Let me handle the legal side. That was easier said than done. The next day, as Robert was clearing debris from the shore, he noticed a group of people standing on the mainland side of the lake. Karen was among them, dressed in a tailored jacket and addressing the small crowd with sweeping gestures. From across the water, he couldn't hear what she was saying, but it didn't matter. The way she pointed toward the island, the approving nods from her audience, it was clear she was rallying support. As the days went on, the pressure increased. Karen's reach was more extensive than Robert had anticipated. Articles began appearing in the local newspaper, painting her as a benevolent figure fighting for community access and historical preservation, while Robert was cast as a selfish outsider hoarding a piece of local heritage. The headlines were damning. Local advocate fights to reclaim shared history. Who owns the island? A community divided. People he didn't know began showing up on boats, circling the island and taking pictures. Some waved cheerfully, others glared. Once, a man yelled at him from the water, calling him a greedy city boy. It was maddening, but Emily's advice echoed in his mind: don't engage. Instead, Robert focused on gathering evidence. He took detailed photographs of the bridge site, the disassembled wood still piled neatly on the shore, and the foundation Karen had poured without permission. He documented every encounter, every intrusion, every suspicious incident. At Emily's suggestion, he also installed additional cameras around the property, positioning them to cover blind spots near the dock and the house. But even as he worked to build his case, Karen's provocations continued. One morning, Robert woke to find garbage scattered across the beach: plastic bottles, fast food wrappers, and a soggy cardboard sign that read "Open the Island." Another day, he discovered fresh tire tracks in the dirt near the shore, leading to a spot where someone had attempted to dig into the rocky ground. Whoever it was hadn't gotten far, but the implication was clear: they were looking for something. The breaking point came late one night when Robert was jolted awake by the sound of an engine. He jumped out of bed and ran to the window, heart pounding. A small motorboat was idling near the dock, its lights off. Two figures moved in the shadows, their voices low but urgent. Robert grabbed his flashlight and stormed outside, shouting at them to leave. The intruders scrambled back into the boat, but not before he caught a glimpse of something metallic in one of their hands: a crowbar or a shovel. He couldn't be sure. The boat sped off into the darkness, leaving Robert shaken and furious. The next morning he called Emily to report the incident. "They're getting bolder," he said. "This isn't just about the bridge anymore. They're searching for something on the island. I need to know what it is." Emily agreed, but cautioned him against confronting Karen directly. "Let me file a motion to expedite the case," she said. "If we can get her under oath, we might be able to force her to reveal what she's after. In the meantime, keep documenting everything." Frustrated but determined, Robert decided to dig deeper into his grandfather's past. If Karen was searching for something on the island, it had to be connected to Howard. He spent hours sifting through the boxes and papers his grandfather had left behind, looking for clues. Among the faded photographs and handwritten notes, he found a weathered journal that seemed to hold the key. The entries were cryptic, full of references to the project and the cache, but one passage stood out: "The island has its secrets, and not all of them are mine. If they ever come looking, they won't find it, not unless they know where to look." Robert's pulse quickened as he read and reread the words. What had his grandfather hidden? And who were they? The journal offered no clear answers, but it was enough to confirm his suspicions. Whatever Karen was after, it wasn't hers to claim. With renewed determination, Robert doubled down on his efforts. He began cross-referencing the journal with old maps and diagrams, piecing together the puzzle of his grandfather's life on the island. At the same time, he worked with Emily to strengthen their legal case, providing her with every scrap of evidence he could find. But even as he gained ground, Karen was already planning her next move. One afternoon, as Robert returned from a trip into town, he found a fresh sign posted near the dock. It bore Karen's name and a bold proclamation, "Restoration project coming soon, a gift to the community." It wasn't just a sign, it was a challenge, a declaration of war. Karen was playing the long game, and Robert knew he would have to outthink her at every turn. The fight for the island was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. The next few weeks passed in a haze of frustration and mounting pressure. Karen's campaign to paint herself as a local hero gained momentum, while Robert found himself increasingly isolated. Every day brought new challenges, more newspaper articles slamming him as an obstacle to progress, more boats lingering around the island, and more debris left on his shore as a form of harassment. Even the few townspeople who had been cautiously sympathetic began avoiding him in public, unwilling to risk being associated with his side of the conflict. Emily worked tirelessly to build his case, but the process was slow and tedious. She managed to secure a temporary injunction preventing Karen from any further construction or excavation on the island, but the victory felt hollow. The damage to Robert's reputation had already been done, and Karen's influence over the town council remained unshaken. It wasn't until Robert received an unexpected phone call that the tide began to shift. The voice on the other end of the line was cautious, almost hesitant. "Mr. Whitney," the man said, "you don't know me, but I think we need to talk. My name is Jim Larson. I used to work for Karen Grayson." Robert gripped the phone tighter. "Why are you calling me?" "Let's just say I've seen how Karen operates and I don't agree with it anymore," Jim replied. "She's not the saint she pretends to be. If you're willing to listen, I can tell you what she's really up to." Robert agreed to meet him at a diner on the edge of town. When he arrived, Jim was already waiting in a corner booth, a nervous-looking man in his 50s with graying hair and a worn expression. Over coffee, Jim began to unravel Karen's carefully constructed facade. According to Jim, Karen's so-called community projects were little more than a front for her real agenda, acquiring valuable properties under the guise of public interest. The bridge to Robert's Island, he explained, was part of a larger scheme. Karen had discovered that the island's rocky terrain contained deposits of a rare mineral used in high-tech manufacturing. She had been working quietly with a private developer to secure rights to the land, planning to mine it under the pretense of a historical restoration. "That's why she's so desperate to take control of the island," Jim said. "It's worth a fortune. And she knows the only way to get it is to convince the town and the courts that she has a legitimate claim." Robert's mind raced as he processed the information. The lawsuit, the forged documents, the relentless smear campaign, it all made sense now. Karen wasn't just an overzealous neighbor with a fondness for community projects. She was a calculating opportunist willing to do whatever it took to get what she wanted. "Why are you telling me this?" Robert asked. Jim hesitated, then sighed. "Because I helped her," he admitted. "I was the one who forged your grandfather's signature on that bridge permit. I thought it was just a harmless technicality at the time, but now I see how far she's willing to go. I can't be a part of it anymore." "Can you prove it?" Robert asked, his voice steady but sharp. Jim nodded. "I still have copies of the original documents, including the ones Karen altered. If you bring this to court, it'll blow her case apart." Robert left the diner with a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he had the upper hand. Armed with Jim's evidence, he and Emily began to dismantle Karen's case piece by piece. They filed motions to subpoena Karen's financial records, which revealed suspicious payments from the developer. They submitted Jim's testimony and the original documents as evidence of fraud, and they began reaching out to the few remaining members of the community who were willing to speak out against Karen's tactics. But Karen was nothing if not resourceful. When news of Jim's defection leaked, she launched a counteroffensive, accusing him of lying to protect Robert. She doubled down on her public relations campaign, hosting a well-publicized event on the mainland to showcase her vision for the island. The event drew a large crowd, including several members of the press, and Karen took full advantage of the spotlight. Standing before a banner that read "Preserving Our Heritage for Future Generations," Karen gave an impassioned speech about the importance of community and the need to protect the island's historical and environmental significance. She dismissed the allegations against her as baseless attacks from a disgruntled former employee and a selfish outsider who didn't understand the town's values. Robert watched the coverage on his laptop, seething with frustration. Karen's performance was masterful, a calculated blend of charm and defiance that left little room for doubt in the minds of her supporters. But Emily reminded him that the court would ultimately decide the case, not public opinion. Still, the public spectacle took its toll. The next time Robert ventured into town, he was met with cold stares and whispered accusations. Someone had spray-painted "Greedy City Boy" on the side of his truck. Even the clerk at the hardware store, who had always been friendly, seemed hesitant to make conversation. Back on the island, Robert threw himself into his work, determined to stay focused. He continued cataloging his grandfather's belongings, hoping to find anything that might strengthen his case. One afternoon, while sifting through a box of old photographs, he stumbled upon a black and white image of his grandfather standing beside a group of men near the shore. The photo was unremarkable at first glance, but Robert's attention was drawn to a small plaque visible in the background. The plaque bore an inscription that was partially obscured by the angle of the photo, but one word stood out clearly: private. Robert's heart raced as he examined the photo more closely. If the plaque was still on the island, it could serve as additional proof that the property had always been private land, contradicting Karen's claims about historical community access. He grabbed a flashlight and set out to find it. After hours of searching along the shoreline, he finally spotted something glinting in the sunlight. It was the plaque, half buried in sand and overgrown with moss, but still intact. The full inscription read, "Private property, no trespassing without permission. Established 1937. Robert carefully cleaned the plaque and took photographs from every angle, documenting its condition and location. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was another piece of the puzzle, one that further weakened Karen's narrative. When he showed the plaque to Emily the next day, she nodded approvingly. "This helps," she said. "It's a physical, verifiable artifact that supports your claim. Combined with Jim's testimony and the financial records, we're building a solid case. But Karen's not going to back down easily. Be prepared for her to escalate." Emily's warning proved prophetic. That night, Robert awoke to the sound of voices outside his cabin. Peering out the window, he saw a group of people gathered near the shore, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Among them was Karen, directing their movements like a conductor leading an orchestra. Robert grabbed his phone and began recording, capturing the scene as Karen's group unloaded tools and equipment from their boat. It was clear they were preparing to dig. He stepped outside, his flashlight sweeping over the group. "You're trespassing," he shouted. "Get off my property, or I'll call the police." Karen turned to face him, her expression cold and defiant. "We're conducting an environmental survey," she said. "Perfectly legal under town ordinance." "You're lying," Robert said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I have an injunction against you, and you know it." Karen smirked. "Injunctions can be appealed," she said. "And as far as I'm concerned, this land isn't yours to protect." Before Robert could respond, one of her group members called out, "We found something." Karen's eyes lit up as she rushed toward the spot, but Robert was already dialing the police. This time, he wasn't going to let her walk away unchallenged. The fight for the island was entering its most dangerous phase, and Robert was prepared to see it through to the end. Robert barely slept after the encounter on the shore. The sight of Karen and her group digging into his land like they owned it burned in his mind. Though the police had eventually shown up and forced her off the island that night, she had left behind more than a mess. The unearthed ground and scattered tools felt like an open challenge, a taunt that said she wasn't finished, no matter how much evidence Robert had stacked against her. The following morning, Robert surveyed the damage. The area they had been digging was near the foundation of an old, unused dock his grandfather had built decades ago. The soil was loose and upturned, and though there was no immediate sign of what they had been searching for, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that they had found something or were close to it. Determined not to let her take another step unchallenged, Robert began documenting everything. He photographed the disturbed ground, the abandoned tools, and even the specific spots where Karen's team had focused their efforts. He noted every detail, down to the size of the holes they had dug. Then, with the help of Emily, he filed a new motion to hold Karen in contempt of court for violating the injunction. Emily wasn't optimistic about swift justice. Even if we get a hearing, it'll take time, she warned him. The courts are slow, and Karen's lawyers know how to stall. She's banking on exhausting you emotionally and financially before we can nail her. You need to be ready for her to escalate further. Escalate she did. The first sign came a few days later when Robert returned from a supply run in town to find a large sign posted at the edge of the island. It was professionally made, with bold black letters proclaiming future site of the Lakeshore Preservation Center, a project by Karen Grayson. The audacity left Robert seething. The sign wasn't just a provocation, it was a public declaration that Karen believed the island was hers to develop. That same afternoon, he noticed two men on a boat circling the island, using what appeared to be surveying equipment. When Robert shouted at them to leave, they ignored him, continuing to map the area as if he didn't exist. Furious, he recorded the encounter and sent the footage to Emily. She's laying the groundwork for a bigger play, Emily said after reviewing the video. She's trying to establish a physical presence on the island so she can argue in court that she's already using the land. If she convinces the judge that the property is in dispute, it'll make it harder for us to keep her off it. How do we stop her? Robert asked. By proving she's overstepping her bounds. Keep documenting everything. The more evidence we have, the better. That night, Robert stayed up late, poring over his grandfather's journal and maps, searching for clues that might explain Karen's obsession with the island. One passage caught his eye, a cryptic note about the southern dock and something his grandfather referred to as a lockbox. The note was vague, but it hinted at a hidden compartment built into the dock's foundation, a place where his grandfather had stored what matters most. Robert's curiosity was piqued, but so was his frustration. If Karen was searching for this lockbox, it might explain why she was so relentless. But what could be inside? Artifacts? Documents? Something valuable enough to justify her underhanded tactics? The following day, Robert decided to investigate the dock himself. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, he spent hours prying apart old wooden planks and searching through the rotting foundation. Eventually, his efforts paid off. Beneath a loose board, he found a small metal compartment, its surface rusted from years of exposure to the elements. Inside was a sealed envelope and a small tin box. The envelope contained a handwritten letter from his grandfather, addressed simply to whoever follows. The letter described his love for the island and his desire to preserve its tranquility. It also warned about those who might try to exploit it for personal gain. The tin box held something even more surprising, a collection of rare geological samples, along with notes detailing the unique mineral deposits found on the island. Robert stared at the papers, a sinking realization dawning on him. This was why Karen wanted the island. The minerals were valuable, potentially worth millions if mined. Robert photographed everything and called Emily to share the discovery. "This changes everything," she said. "If we can prove Karen knew about these deposits before she started her so-called restoration project, it'll blow her argument apart. She'll look like a greedy opportunist instead of a community advocate." But Karen wasn't about to let her plans unravel so easily. That evening, Robert's cameras captured another intrusion. This time, a group of men arrived under the cover of darkness and began unloading heavy machinery near the shore. When Robert confronted them, they claimed to be conducting environmental research on Karen's behalf. Robert called the police, but by the time they arrived, the men had already packed up and left. The officers were sympathetic but powerless to do much. "It's a civil matter," one of them said. "Unless there's clear evidence of criminal activity, our hands are tied." Frustrated and outnumbered, Robert decided to take matters into his own hands. He spent the next day reinforcing the island's perimeter, placing barricades along the most accessible entry points, and installing additional motion-activated lights and cameras. He even set up a makeshift alarm system near the old dock, determined to catch anyone who tried to sneak onto the property again. Despite his efforts, Karen continued her campaign undeterred. She began holding public meetings in town, rallying support for her vision of the Lakeshore Preservation Center. Her speeches were filled with lofty rhetoric about preserving history and protecting the environment, But Robert knew the truth. It was all a smokescreen to mask her real intentions. The tipping point came when Karen filed a motion to have the injunction against her lifted, arguing that her project was critical to the community's interests. The court scheduled a hearing, and Emily warned Robert to prepare for a fight. "This is her power play," Emily said. "If the judge sides with her, it'll give her free rein to keep pushing onto the island. We need to make sure she doesn't get that chance." The night before the hearing, Robert received an anonymous tip, a handwritten note slipped under his door. It read, "Check the town records for Karen's developer contracts. You'll find what you're looking for." The message was cryptic, but Robert had no time to question it. Early the next morning, he went to the municipal office and requested copies of Karen's filings. Among the documents, he found a contract between Karen's organization and a private mining company, outlining plans to extract minerals from the island. It was the smoking gun he needed. Armed with the contract, the geological samples, and his grandfather's letter, Robert and Emily presented their case in court. They argued that Karen's project was a thinly veiled attempt to exploit the island's resources for personal profit, using fraudulent claims and community support as cover. Karen's lawyer tried to dismiss the evidence as circumstantial, but the judge wasn't convinced. The contract was damning, and Jim's testimony about the forged signature only added to Karen's troubles. By the end of the hearing, the judge ruled to uphold the injunction and ordered Karen to cease all activities related to the island until the case was resolved. For the first time in weeks, Robert felt a glimmer of hope. Karen's web of lies was unraveling, and he was finally gaining the upper hand. But he knew better than to let his guard down. Karen wasn't done yet, and the battle for the island was far from over. The courtroom was silent except for the steady ticking of a clock mounted on the far wall. Robert sat at the plaintiff's table next to Emily, his hands tightly clasped as Karen took the stand. This was at the moment he had been fighting for over the past few months. Everything hinged on what would unfold in the next few hours. Karen sat with practiced poise, her demeanor calm and collected, but Robert could see the cracks beneath her polished exterior. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes and an air of no-nonsense authority, adjusted her glasses and leaned forward. "Ms. Grayson," the judge began, "you've been accused of violating multiple injunctions, submitting falsified documents, and misrepresenting the nature of your so-called preservation project. Let's start with the most pressing question. What exactly were you looking for on Mr. Whitney's island?" Karen's lawyer rose swiftly, objecting to the phrasing, but the judge waved him off. "The question stands." Karen cleared her throat and managed a tight smile. "Your Honor, I wasn't looking for anything specific. My goal has always been to restore and preserve the island as a historical and educational site for the community." Emily stood and approached the witness stand, her expression composed but steely. "Ms. Grayson," she began, holding up a copy of the mining contract Robert had discovered, "can you explain why a contract between your organization and a private mining company outlines plans to extract valuable minerals from the island? Minerals you claim not to know about?" Karen's face paled slightly, but she quickly recovered. "That document was a preliminary discussion, nothing more," she said. "I never intended to follow through with it. It was simply an exploration of possibilities to fund the restoration project." "Interesting," Emily said, her voice calm but cutting. "And yet the terms of the contract include profit-sharing percentages and specific timetables for mineral extraction. Doesn't sound very preliminary to me." Karen's lawyer objected again, this time claiming irrelevance, but the judge overruled him. Emily continued, pressing harder with each question. "You also claim the bridge was built for public access," Emily said, flipping through a stack of papers. "But isn't it true that you applied for that permit using a forged signature, one that belongs to a man who had been deceased for over a year?" Karen's composure began to falter. "I had no knowledge of that signature being forged," she said, her voice tight. "If there was an error, it wasn't my doing." Emily didn't let up. "So you're saying it's a coincidence that your employee Jim Larson, who has testified under oath, admitted to forging the signature on your orders?" Karen's lawyer stood again, visibly agitated. "Your Honor, this line of questioning is inflammatory and speculative." The judge glared at him. "Sit down, counselor. I'd like to hear Ms. Grayson's answer." Karen hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the stand. "I trusted Mr. Larson to handle the paperwork," she said finally. "If he acted improperly, that's on him, not me." Robert clenched his jaw, suppressing the urge to speak. He could see the courtroom shifting. Karn's confident facade was crumbling under Emily's relentless cross-examination. Then came the final blow. Emily walked back to the plaintiff's table and retrieved the tin box Robert had discovered under the dock. She held it up for the court to see. "Ms. Grayson," she said, her voice ringing through the room, "this box was found on Mr. Whitney's island. Inside were rare geological samples and detailed notes about the mineral deposits you were so interested in. Do you still claim you weren't looking for anything specific?" Karen's expression hardened, but she didn't answer. The silence was deafening. The judge spoke after a long pause, her tone decisive. "I've seen enough. Ms. Grayson, your actions show a blatant disregard for the law and for this court's previous orders. The evidence presented here is overwhelming. Not only have you violated the injunction, but you've engaged in fraudulent and unethical behavior to further your personal interests." Karen's lawyer attempted to object one last time, but the judge cut him off. "Ms. Grayson, you will cease all activities related to Mr. Whitney's property immediately. Furthermore, I'm referring this case for criminal investigation into the forged documents and your dealings with the mining company." Robert exhaled deeply, relief washing over him like a wave. Emily placed a reassuring hand on his arm as the judge concluded her ruling. Karen, for her part, sat frozen in her chair, her mask of control completely shattered. As the courtroom emptied, Karen passed by Robert without a word, her eyes burning with unspoken fury. For a moment he thought she might say something, but she simply straightened her shoulders and walked out, her lawyer trailing behind her. "Congratulations," Emily said as they stepped outside. "You won." Robert nodded, though the victory felt bittersweet. The battle had taken its toll on him mentally, emotionally, and financially. But as he looked out across the lake, he felt a sense of closure. The island was his, free from Karen's grasp, and he could finally begin to rebuild his life and his peace. Or so he thought, because as he walked back to his truck, he noticed something unusual: a man in a suit leaning against a car, watching him with a faint, knowing smile. The man tipped his hat and drove off, leaving Robert with an unsettling feeling that Karen's schemes might not be entirely over. In the weeks following the court's decision, Robert returned to the island with a mix of relief and exhaustion. The legal victory over Karen had been hard-fought, but it came at a price. The once serene refuge he had sought had become a battleground, its quiet shores now scarred by the chaos of the past months. The disassembled bridge still lay in a pile near the shoreline, a stark reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. The first thing Robert did was clear the remnants of Karen's intrusion. He dismantled the sign she had posted, threw out the trash her supporters had dumped on his property, and filled in the holes her team had dug during their midnight escapades. Each task felt like reclaiming a piece of himself, a small act of defiance against the chaos she had brought to his life. With Emily's help, he ensured that Karen's court-mandated fines and restitution payments were enforced. The funds she was ordered to pay would help him recover some of the costs he had incurred during the fight, though no amount of money could truly compensate for the stress and disruption she had caused. Karen's public reputation was in shambles. The media that had once championed her cause turned against her as details of her fraudulent activities came to light. Her allies abandoned her, and her influence in the town evaporated. Robert, however, found no satisfaction in her downfall. The victory felt hollow. The island had been his sanctuary, a place where he could reconnect with his creativity and escape the noise of the world. Now, it was a place of conflict and memory, a reminder of how easily peace could be shattered. One afternoon, while exploring the southern edge of the island, Robert came across the plaque he had found buried in the sand weeks earlier. He cleaned it carefully and mounted it near the dock. The words "private property, no trespassing without permission," established 1937, stood as a clear declaration to anyone who might consider challenging his claim in the future. But even as Robert worked to restore the island, he couldn't shake the unease that lingered from the encounter outside the courthouse. The man in the suit, with his knowing smile and silent departure, felt like an unfinished thread in the tangled web Karen had spun. Though there had been no further signs of trouble, Robert remained vigilant. He upgraded the island's security system, installed new cameras, and reinforced the boundaries with additional signage. Despite the lingering tension, life slowly began to return to normal. Robert reconnected with his work, finding inspiration in the fight he had endured. He began writing again, pouring his experiences into a screenplay that captured the complex dynamics of power, greed, and resilience. The island, once a place of retreat, had become the heart of his story, a setting rich with conflict and meaning. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the lake shimmered with golden light, Robert sat on the porch with a glass of whiskey in hand. The air was quiet, save for the gentle lapping of water against the shore. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of calm, a fragile but welcome peace. He thought of his grandfather, then of the journal, the tin box, and the letter warning about those who might try to exploit the island's secrets. Howard had known the value of this place, not just in terms of its natural beauty or its resources, but as a symbol of independence and self-reliance. Robert vowed to honor that legacy, to protect the island not just for himself, but for what it represented. As the stars began to appear, Robert made a final decision. He would keep the island private, but he wouldn't let it become a fortress. He planned to open it selectively to artists and writers, turning it into a place of inspiration and creativity. It was a way to reclaim its purpose, to transform the site of conflict into something meaningful. Karen was gone, her plans unraveled, but the lessons Robert had learned from their battle would stay with him. The fight for the island had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated, forcing him to confront not just external threats, but his own fears and doubts. And in the end, he realized that struggle had given him something far more valuable than victory. It had given him a story worth telling.